Let's see how we can use Final Gather to calculate indirect illumination in an interior scene lit by sunlight coming through the window. Click on the Application button, Open. In the Chapter 5 directory inside of our Scenes directory, select the file called Chapter 5 Interior Final Gather 01.max. Click Open to open the file. This is an interior scene that's an adaptation of the laboratory scene that we used earlier that has a window in place of the big vent fan that was in the original file. The first thing we'll do is save this with an incremental file name. Click the Application button, Save As. Click the Increment button. If you're asked to overwrite a file, go ahead and overwrite it. The scene is set so that it has a daylight system that is providing the light for the interior. There are a few lights inside the scene, however, they're turned off and not adding any illumination to the scene. The only illumination in this scene is the daylight system coming through the window. Click the Render button and wait for the render to finish. As we can see, we have a problem with the rendering. The surfaces that are struck by the light are illuminated. However, the surfaces that are in shadow are completely black. In this scene, there's no bounce light or indirect illumination being calculated. We're just seeing the direct light. What we'll do now is we'll enable the Final Gather option. It will sample the pixels that are receiving the direct light, and it will sample the surfaces surrounding these pixels, then adapt all of the pixels accordingly. One way we can enable Final Gathering is to use the Final Gather Precision slider right over here. Currently you'll see that it says Final Gather Disabled. By dragging the slider to the right, it allows us to increase the quality of the Final Gather that we're rendering in the scene. Click and drag the slider one notch over to the right until you see the Draft Mode option appear above it. Draft Mode is the most efficient way to calculate Final Gather. Let's click the Render button in the Render Frame window and let that render progress. You'll immediately see the difference in our scene. The first thing you'll see is that 3ds Max is calculating the Final Gather for the indirect lighting in the scene. Once it completes the Final Gather pass, it will then go ahead and render the final image using the indirect lighting calculated in the Final Gather stage. This is noticeably slower than just rendering the direct illumination by itself. Now we can see some detail starting to show up in areas that were just black shadows. When we set up the daylight system in the scene, by default it set the exposure control to be exterior daylight. What we're rendering, however, is interior daylight. We have considerably less light coming into this room than we're exposing for. If you do any photography and you think about how this is actually working, if you go outside and you take your camera and you set your exposure level for the fact that you're outside on a sunny day, when you take the photograph, it will be properly exposed for that level of brightness. If you don't change the exposure on the camera and you bring the camera inside to take a photograph using the same settings, your photograph will come out extremely dark. The reason for this is that the exposure is set for conditions of extremely bright light and not for dark interior spaces. Therefore, in order to get a satisfactory photograph, you have to readjust the exposure in order to compensate for the darker environment. You have to do the same thing inside of 3ds Max. We'll need to adjust the Mental Ray photographic exposure control in order to adapt it to interior daylight lighting. If you want, go ahead and let the render continue. I'm going to stop mine by holding the Escape button, or click the Cancel button. That'll cancel the render. Since this is not the result I want and I can see what's going on, I don't need to continue with the rendering. We'll select the rendering menu from the main menu bar. From the drop-down menu, select Exposure Control. And right here we see that in the Mental Ray Photographic Exposure Control rollout, our exposure is set to an exposure value, or EV, of 15. A value of 15 would be used for bright daylight. In the preset list, go ahead and open it and select the Indoor Daylight option. You'll see this drops the exposure value to 10. The smaller the number, the more light it allows into the camera and the brighter the rendering will be. We'll go ahead and click the Render button and re-render the scene, We should see immediately that there is considerably more light being calculated. There's more light reaching the renderer because we have adjusted the exposure control to allow for more light into the camera. We'll just let this render for a minute just to get an idea of what our scene looks like and how bright it is. When the rendering is complete, go ahead and press Ctrl+S to save the file.